We wanted to bring together some of the most eminent experts, and we are lucky to have asked for a dream list and then our dream team of the most distinguished experts to discuss these issues with the collective experience in the White House, the Justice Department, the State Department, as lawyers and policymakers, as scholars, experts, and litigators. Our panelists have been working at the very intersection of these fundamental rule of law issues, and they'll be looking at the elections themselves, how the process unfolded, and what we can look to in the future and what we can expect in the coming days, weeks, months, and years. So I just want to turn it over to my good friend and colleague, Professor Josh Geltzer, who'll be our moderator. Many of you, all of you may know Josh already. He's the perfect person to lead our discussion. He has his fingers in all of the pies that we're discussing, a unique expert with great breadth and depth of knowledge. Josh is formerly the executive director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown. He was a former senior director for counterterrorism and former deputy legal advisor at the National Security Council. So Josh will introduce our panelists and get us off to the discussion. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Ryan, and thanks to your colleagues, to Rachel Goldbrenner, to everyone at the Reese Center, everyone at Just Security who put this together. I have been looking forward to this conversation all week in the midst of an exhausting, bewildering, confusing, emotional week. When I thought about where the election process goes from here, when I thought about the disinformation that's swirling, when I thought about the role of unlawful militias in relation to Election Day and thereafter, these three folks are the ones I wanted to hear from. And I've been genuinely excited to get this discussion going. And we have so much ground to cover and such a wonderful trio to cover it with that I'm going to keep introductions very short, far more short than all three of them deserve, and then just dive into the conversation. But quickly here, I'll do this in alphabetical order. We have Mary McCord, longtime federal prosecutor, ran the criminal piece of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., then moved to Main Justice. She's corrected me in the past when I've called that moving to the Justice Department, because those of us who work at the Justice Department in the main building may feel that way, but in fact, she was always at the Justice Department as a prosecutor. But she moved to Main Justice to the National Security Division, which she ran. And now I have the pleasure of working with Mary day in and day out at the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown Law, where Mary is the legal director. And you have probably heard from, seen from, read in the New York Times from Mary about a whole bunch of issues in relation to this election, voter suppression, voter intimidation, and the roles of armed individuals and private militias in that. We're going to dive into all of that. We also have with us today Laura Rosenberger, again, somebody who has worked at senior levels of our government at the National Security Council, at the State Department, where she was chief of staff to the deputy secretary. Upon leaving government, she created the Hamilton 68 project, which has just been such an amazing resource in tracking disinformation, who's disseminating it, how, when. You have surely been reading and seeing her as well. She too had a wonderful New York Times op-ed in relation to Election Day. She had a wonderful foreign affairs piece recently on disinformation after Election Day and during the transition. So again, tons to talk about with Laura that we will get into momentarily. And we have Kate Shaw joining us, again, senior government official. She was a special assistant to the president in the White House counsel's office, former clerk to Justice Stevens at the Supreme Court. You have probably been seeing her on ABC this week as she helps us all decipher what's happening in the election. She's a contributor there at ABC, a co-host of the podcast Strict Scrutiny, and she teaches at Cardozo Law. And Laura is currently at the German Marshall Fund. I left out her current affiliation amidst this, but Kate is, among things you may have been reading from her, she had a fantastic recent Atlantic piece on the law of the transition and how it might guide the days and weeks to come. So I want to make sure we get into that. But thanks to all three of you for doing this. Three of the just most perfect people to discuss these topics. Also just three incredibly kind and generous folks from whom I am constantly learning a ton. So let's dive in. I encourage folks to ask questions using the Q&A feature throughout. I'm happy to filter those into the conversation as relevant. And of course, we'll make sure we leave time for that at the end, even though I confess, I'm sure I will still have more questions I'll want to ask. But Kate, let's start with you. And our focus here is on the election, the transition in relation to national security. The biggest national security and public safety threat we faced in the lead up to the election, and that we still face as a country right now, is surely this horrible pandemic still raging across the United States. That led to some legal adaptations, to some changes in some states about how individuals can vote, how they did vote. Give us, it's a very broad question, but take us where you want to take us. What were the changes that struck you as most interesting? How did they actually play out come election day? Where does that leave us in terms of a legal landscape right now?
Sure. Well, thanks, Josh, and thanks to Rachel and others for organizing this. You know, we are in this sort of odd period of election week because states took very responsible steps to adapt their election processes in order to account for the raging pandemic, right? So many states for the first time made voting by mail available with no excuse to any voter who wished to participate that way. And so we all knew coming into election day that those changes meant that we would just have to be a little patient, particularly if the vote was close before, you know, in order to ascertain the winner in a number of states. And so what's playing out this week is the expected result of those, again, responsible changes that allowed many, many more Americans than ever had to, you know, vote in a way that felt safe for them and safe for their families. And, you know, unfortunately, even while extending access to voting by mail, a number of state legislatures, including, you know, critically the state of Pennsylvania, did not also change state law to allow for the opening, processing, and counting of absentee ballots prior to election day. And that is why we are just in the position of needing to practice a little bit of patience as we wait for these returns to come in, because, you know, officials didn't get to start counting them until election day at the earliest in states like Pennsylvania. So, you know, and I think we were all intellectually prepared for this, you know, timeline to look and feel very different from previous presidential elections. And yet I don't know that there was a way to emotionally prepare for sort of the roller coaster of this week. So it felt different, even if you kind of expected, you know, these kind of jumps to be part of the process. And obviously the election day turnout to very heavily favor President Trump as it did, and then the absentee voting to very heavily favor Joe Biden as it appears to be doing. So that is the backdrop. So we are where we are this week, you know, because I think of responsible decisions made by state officials in order to change the way we do elections because of this pandemic. And I do think that going into the transition, so, you know, as Ryan said at the outset, this is, you know, we are kind of at a pivot point right now. So counting is still happening. I think that there will be additional calls made today, but, you know, in states in which the margin is as close as it appears right now, there will be recounts. And, you know, the numbers may jump a little bit in each direction. The fact of the matter is that recounts rarely change more than a couple hundred votes. So I don't think it's at all likely that a state result will change as a result of a recount, but it may delay the inevitable for a little bit of time. But the pandemic background is is I think the reason that we need to be the most attentive to the way the transition appears to be getting off the ground, because we are in a moment of some sort of transition, I think maybe starting today, and in some ways under the law starting in September and even in June in certain respects, and we can talk about the legal framework at some point, but you know, an actual sort of smooth, cohesive transition in order to position an incoming Biden administration to respond effectively to this, you know, raging and worsening pandemic seems critical. Transitions from a national security perspective are vulnerable times in the best of circumstances, and we are far from in the best of circumstances. So I think there are reasons to be concerned about what happens in the next, 75-ish days between now and inauguration. But I also think, as I argued in the Atlantic op-ed that you mentioned, Josh, that there actually is a legal architecture that surrounds transitions that gives me some reason for comfort that whatever is proceeding in sort of the political domain with respect to potentially attempting to undermine results or even to pursue legal challenges to the results of the election, there's a parallel track along which transition operations can be proceeding that should give us some comfort that that can happen independently of the political processes that may sort of delay the inevitable. So maybe I'll stop at the outset, and I think there's lots more I'm happy to talk about, but I want to give the others a chance to get into.
No, that's perfect, Kate. That brought us up exactly where I hope to be. And I definitely want to come back to some of that transition stuff. So it also tees up a question for Laura, because as as you were preaching patience, Kate, when you're on TV, as you and Mary and I and our colleagues on the National Task Force on Election Crises preached patience, there are other actors who were poised to preach exactly the opposite and to fill the information space quite differently. So Laura, tell us a little bit what you anticipated in the disinformation space as we got to this rather distinctive election day, and what you're seeing even in the few days that have unfolded since.
Well, thanks, Josh. It's also so great to be here with all of you, and thanks to colleagues for putting it together. I want to actually start by picking up on a really important point that Kate made, which is that as much as many of us did a lot of work to intellectually prepare people for this moment, and frankly to prepare ourselves, when the emotion takes over, it provides a different set of challenges. And I think when talking about disinformation, emotion is a really important starting point. We often talk about disinformation in terms of rational frameworks of true or false. And frankly, many of us who work on disinformation hardly ever even use that term anymore, because it's largely not an accurate characterization of what we're talking about. Information manipulation pursues many different strategies. Disinformation, the use of demonstrably and deliberately false information, is actually a small subset of what we're talking about. Most of the content that we see is emotionally manipulative content that seeks to prey on people's uncertainty, and it seeks to inject doubt into whether it's institutions or frankly into the idea of truth itself. And in the run-up to today, to kind of come to your question, Josh, one of the things that I was very worried about was less about disinformation or foreign interference in advance of the election. Yes, I was worried about that. But my concern had always been primarily this period after the election for a couple of different reasons. One, we know that in 2016, the Russians had a play on the books. They didn't run. It was a play that they intended to run if Hillary Clinton had won the election. And it was a play designed to basically inject doubt into the integrity of the election outcome and to undermine people's faith in President-elect Clinton, basically to delegitimize her. And I had a lot of concerns that we might see something similar from a foreign actor this time around, and that could be combined with something that a lot of analysts refer to as perception hacking. So potentially creating the impression that there had been some sort of cyber intrusion or other event that had created a lack of integrity in the process. And frankly, that sort of claim could then be used by domestic actors who were simultaneously and are now trying to undermine respect for and faith in the outcome. I will say that so far, the good news is that we haven't seen much activity from foreign actors over the past few days. The vast majority, I should say, at least that we know of, right? At least from all the analysis that we see, the vast majority of disinformation and efforts to undermine confidence in the election outcome have been domestic. And whatever amplification we see from foreign actors is not having a measurable impact in the broader information ecosystem. Now that could change, and I'm certainly not of the view that we are out of the woods. I mean, I think that from a foreign actor perspective, there's still a lot of things that could happen during the transition period. And frankly, Josh has heard me say many times over that foreign interference isn't just about elections, and elections provide an acute and particularly insidious moment for those sorts of operations, but it doesn't begin and end with election cycles. But I think while we need to stay vigilant, so far, there's a relatively good news story on the foreign side. On the domestic side, it is a very, very different story. And I think, frankly, that for many of us that, who have the kinds of conversations and read the New York Times and the Atlantic as we do, I actually think that many of us are out of touch with the information ecosystem that a large portion of America exists in. And I think, if Vice President Biden is declared the winner and assumes office in January, that it's going to be essential for the Biden administration and for those of us who believe in democracy and the integrity of it to get a much better handle on the rampant disinformation that is taking hold and really threatens our democracy from within. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about some of that. I'd frankly prefer not to amplify some of the conspiracy theories that we're seeing. But I guess the last point I would say, and this was the point of my New York Times piece, is that, you know, our adversaries, our foreign adversaries, and then I would say some of the enemies of democracy from within, their goal is for us to lose faith in our democracy, in our election systems, in our institutions. And it's so critical. That's why patience is so important. That's why having faith here is so critical, even when it's trying for all of us, because it is our profession of faith in the process that is the antidote to those who seek to undermine our faith in it.
That is an exquisite laydown of the information environment around this election, and I definitely want to come back to where you left us there. But let's go to Mary. And in the swirl of things to worry about as this election approached, we had the virus, as Kate has discussed. We had the information space. You were working hard on the questions of private militias and even more broadly, armed voter intimidation, voter suppression. And take us through sort of the worries as election day approached, and then what you saw on election day itself, Mary, and maybe bring us a few days forward to where we are now as well.
Sure, thanks. And when you see me distracted looking over is because I am getting constant alerts from a law enforcement community, including the one I just got about people, some arrests being made in Philly, having to do with a vehicle full of armed individuals that has just arrived there in Philly. So that's sort of like the thing that I've been worrying about, which is now starting to materialize. And like Laura, I don't really want to amplify it, but I do want to explain why when I keep going like this, that's why that is. So we were very worried coming into the election itself that armed so-called militia groups, sometimes they call themselves civil guard units, really they're just vigilante armed groups, would use this election as a time to deploy to the polls, ostensibly to protect against voter fraud in response to what the president has been, you know, the drumbeat he's been engaged in for the last several months, suggesting that mail-in vote ballots are fraudulent, that any election that doesn't result in a win for him is rigged. Of course, these are things he's continuing to say and said last night on, you know, in his public statement. And that given the call and response relationship between unlawful militia groups and the president, as we've seen over the last 3 years, and particularly this year alone, you know, responding to like liberate Michigan, liberate Minnesota, liberate Virginia by these armed offensive protests and really coercive displays by storming state houses and demanding the end of shutdown orders, et cetera. We've also seen a similar call and response during the racial justice demonstrations throughout the summer and continuing into the fall, where, you know, in response or in conjunction with statements by the president and his surrogates that all of acts of violence were being done by violent anarchists and by Antifa, and calling Antifa domestic terrorists. We've seen these same groups then also self-deploy to ostensibly protect property against these violent anarchists. All of this, to Laura's point, amplified by disinformation and misinformation over social media. So our fears going into election day that it was that the same call response would take place, and we would have armed groups intimidating voters at the polls and also greatly heightening the risk to public safety. I mean, their presence, as we've seen over the course of the summer, can lead to tragic results. The shootings and deaths in Kenosha, shootings in Albuquerque, shootings in Portland and elsewhere. So I'm happy to say that we saw really almost none of that at the polls. Josh and my organization, state and local leaders, law enforcement officials, mayors, prosecutors, other organizations have really spent the last couple of months pushing information out, making clear that these groups are unlawful. They have no authority under federal or state law. They're not protected by the Second Amendment. They're barred in every single state. The only lawful militia is a state militia, that's the National Guard, or other state militia that's under the direction and control of the governor. And I think that that message did resonate. We saw more and more states' attorney generals making strong statements. Like I said, district attorneys, police chiefs. We had the opportunity, myself and others, to address large groups of mayors and police chiefs, et cetera, as well as voting rights groups and activist groups, and pushed out lots and lots of materials with the legal case that this stuff is not lawful. In fact, our materials were actually cited by a prominent unlawful militia group in their directions to their members not to go to the polls and engage in voter intimidation. So, so I think, that was successful. We saw isolated incidents of 1 or 2 armed individuals around polling places, but they weren't in military garb. They weren't pretending to patrol the lines. And in most cases, they were there for a very short period of time and moved on. Like Laura, I've been actually more concerned about this post-election space, which is so heavily dependent on what the president is saying and what his supporters, how they're responding. And I think one reason maybe that we're not seeing a lot of foreign interference is, they don't even have to interfere. Like we're doing it to ourselves. The conspiracy theories, the lies, the disinformation, the misinformation, it's coming, fast and furious now. So far, knock wood, we also have not seen, violent protests. I'm hoping we won't. I think that state and local officials and law enforcement are well prepared around the country. They've been preparing for the possibility of this. I do think that things like the Michigan takedown of the plot to kidnap the governor has also let these unlawful militias know that there's attention being paid to them by law enforcement, by the FBI. There have been other isolated arrests of the more extremist groups, Boogaloo Boys, et cetera. So I'm cautiously optimistic we are not going to see as much as we might have. That said, there seems to be more mobilizing happening today. I hope it's still just small groups and not large groups. And I think a lot of the talk, a lot of what's on social media is just that, it's talk. I mean, it's such an easy place to say really, really extremist and inflammatory things. It is a far different thing to actually, step out of that virtual space into the physical space and take actions that these groups know could result in their arrests and prosecutions and potentially, some significant time in prison. So I'm hoping that will be a disincentive, but we've got to stay vigilant and we've got to, make sure information as it's coming in, disinformation, to Laura's point, is being channeled to the people who are in a position to do something about it.
So I think we've set up the landscape perfectly now. We have the pandemic, we have responses, adaptations that have demanded patience from all of us. We have the information space, we have the physical space and those who might try to bring violence into it. Let's get into the transition itself a little bit. Kate, can you talk us through what are the key laws that guide what a normal transition should look like?
Sure. So there's really just one big federal statute, the Presidential Transition Act, passed in 1964, and amended a bunch of times in fairly significant ways since. So prior to 64, transitions were pretty informal affairs, right? The president-elect typically just took a long vacation and picked a cabinet, and that was essentially it. But there was increasing formalization, in particular, over the last half century, and they are now extremely staffed, large, active operations. And again, there is this statutory framework that surrounds them. So, and the kind of successive amendments to the Presidential Transition Act both provide additional resources, physical space, funds, things of that nature to transition operations. But they've also shifted the start date of the transition earlier and earlier. So actually essentially at the time that there is a major party candidate known, and especially after the actual convention, first candidate or presumptive candidate and then actual candidate actually has access to quite a lot of resources of government. And some of that is a result of changes just in the last 5 years, the extent of the access that a nominee has or candidate has to, again, spaces and, what I maybe we'll call sort of the kind of intellectual resources of the federal government. So where we are right now, so there's an MOU, a memorandum of understanding that the Biden campaign has entered into with the head of the General Services Administration, GSA, that provides for office space, computers, other kinds of resources for the Biden transition. Now, I don't have a lot of details. I presume they're not using the physical spaces as much as a transition in ordinary times would, simply because so many of us are still working remotely. But those resources are available. And that includes, email addresses at .gov domain and other sorts of resources. The current MOU expires by its terms on November 3rd. At which point the head of the GSA is supposed to be able to ascertain the apparent winner of the election. And then the candidate becomes the president-elect, and a significant number of additional resources are unlocked. So I think we are in a little bit of a liminal zone at the moment, right? Because so the statute basically, and I'm actually going to read from the statute, defines the president-elect as such persons as are the apparent successful candidates for president and vice president as ascertained by the administrator, and that's the administrator of the GSA, following the general elections in accordance with Title III, the Electoral Count Act. So there's not typically a hard question about how the GSA administrator will ascertain the identity of the winner of a presidential election, right? It is not technically speaking until mid-December, December 14th this year, that the electors in the states formally cast their votes for president, and not actually until January 6th that those votes are opened in Congress. But there's never been any interest in or need to wait until any of those calendar benchmarks are hit before actually ascertaining the winner of the election. And typically it has happened, on election day or the next day. And then the sort of much more formal and extensive transition operations have begun. Big exception in recent years, of course, was 2000, in which there was no apparent winner that could be ascertained by the head of GSA until December 12th, when the Supreme Court decided Bush versus Gore, and Gore formally conceded the election. At that point, the formal transition operation began. GSA had actually sought an opinion from the Office of Legal Counsel about whether it could recognize both two transitions and essentially try to provide resources to both. And OLC said, no, there's really only one president-elect that the act recognizes and provides for this, these resources. And so there was no formally recognized, it's not that there was no transition operation, but it didn't happen under the auspices of this kind of formal structure of a government a transition that sort of dwells in some sense within the federal government. So I am not sure how the GSA administrator will approach that task right now. The head of GSA is a political appointee, but someone who has significant experience at the GSA, also on Capitol Hill. I don't know much about her. Emily Murphy is her name. And so far the statements from GSA have been, we will comply with the law. And indeed, so far, all of the statutory benchmarks, so June 1st, a report about the government's activities to begin to prepare for transition was due and was in fact provided to Congress. September 1st, there was another statutory deadline for essentially just confirming to Congress that some of these kind of more technical provisions of the Presidential Transition Act, which I have walked through, but involve designating different agency heads to coordinate transition activities within agencies and then across the federal government, just to confirm that all of those benchmarks were being hit. And so far it looks as though they've all been complied with, and the GSA administrator has again assured that sort of all legal, statutory, constitutional requirements will be abided by. But, there is still going to be a hard legal question about sort of when she may make the formal determination that Joe Biden is the president-elect. And that may take a few weeks. It may just be a few days. It may just be a few weeks. It could be a few days. The MOU, so I started by talking about this MOU. The MOU says if there's a delay in the GSA administrator making this determination, the existing pre-election transition resources will be extended. So the Biden team has access to the same transition resources that the candidate and his operation did. And again, they're not as extensive. They may not, for example, include the ability to get detailees from federal agencies, which is something that the president-elect is entitled to do under the Presidential Transition Act. So federal workers, right, get loaned to the transition. And that's a significant addition to the otherwise existent staffing that a transition may have available. I don't think that's hugely significant, although it would be helpful, obviously, to get access to detailees. The rest of it, so the PTA is the structure, but a lot of what happens within agencies and between agencies in the transition, I think, happens, with the overhang of the Presidential Transition Act, but not in ways that are really formally structured or guided by it. So it actually seems very clear to me that even starting now, the Biden transition operation would be within its rights to begin reaching out to officers in federal agencies, the agency transition coordinator in each agency, if they want to begin to sort of embark on this kind of briefing process that a transition will typically really involve. And I think there's some legal gray area surrounding how agency actors would respond to such requests. I'm not sure there's going to be clear direction from the White House. I'm not sure that kind of direction would be binding if it was forthcoming, because the kind of general understanding of the Presidential Transition Act, which has some specificity, but just also expresses a general desire to facilitate this smooth, well-coordinated kind of transfer of power for all kinds of, stability, national security, other kinds of, purposes, reasons. It seems to me that it would be certainly consistent with the spirit of the Presidential Transition Act for agency actors to facilitate, to the extent that they could, the Biden team's request for things like, briefing, opinions, things of that nature. But we're in a little bit of a gray area. I am not sure I don't have any visibility inside what is happening in GSA or in the Biden transition, but these are the kinds of questions I think are important for us to be thinking and talking about.
And let me ask you, Kate, if you'll indulge me, a sort of multiple choice, super quick follow-up on that, which is just an extraordinary laydown you gave us of the law of transition, what normal should look like, which is, as this GSA administrator goes about making this ascertainment call, there are things that could influence at least maybe how soon or how late that happens. Litigation, recount. What role, none, total, or somewhere in between, do you think a concession by Donald Trump should play in an agency head's consideration of ascertainment?
Well, I think it would certainly be sufficient, but I also don't think it's necessary. So I think it would certainly smooth the process. I think that she would very quickly make the determination. But I think that, if you believe that it is not just courts, but other government actors who have an important role in, interpreting law and the Constitution, the head of an important government agency has every power on her own. Sort of, if there's a pending question that seems like it could be outcome determinative in the Supreme Court, it actually seems to me that it would be prudent for her to withhold that kind of judgment or determination, maybe while facilitating some additional access to kind of transition resources beyond just what the pre-election MOU would provide, but not making the ultimate determination. But short of something like that pending in the Supreme Court, it seems to me a determination that she is empowered to make without a formal concession, especially if there's a clear signal that there will be no concession under any circumstances. Sort of that can't be the only factor that matters. And there, I think that the behavior and the statements by other government officials, senior members of the president's party, the sort of civil society more broadly, all of that seem to me to matter in terms of shaping the kind of decision that she might make. And again, it may not be the kind of binary that the statute provides, or there is a binary for sure in the statute, but it may be that there is a lot that she would be able to do to facilitate transition without or prior to making the formal determination, if she feels it is responsible to delay at least for some short period of time. At a certain point, maybe say one more thing. I mean, at a certain point, I think that access to kind of the most sensitive type of kind of intelligence briefings, that in some ways is where, I mean, we talked about the pandemic, that I think is critical, but there are also all kinds of obviously national security and intelligence questions that I think would, I think that there are different kinds of decisions. I don't think that there's anything precluding certain kinds of access being granted even prior to a formal determination, actually. But I think it would the formal determination would facilitate all of that. So to talk again for a minute about 2000 and 2001, the 9/11 Commission report did identify the delay in granting security clearances and other kinds of things to the Bush team. So we're only 9 months after inauguration, that September 11th happens. was a very short transition, of course, because it didn't start until mid-December. And so there were people who didn't even have their security clearances yet by, that following September. No one has ever made any kind of causal claim, but it was clear that there was a vulnerability inside the federal government that was in part a result of the delayed transition and then sort of the slow granting of security clearances and other things. All this to just say that transitions in the immediate transition period present all kinds of potential vulnerabilities. And so the kind of sooner the better on kind of getting everyone fully, briefed and clearances granted and things of that nature, even separate and apart from the pandemic issues that we began talking about.
So let's shift to Mary now. So we've mentioned litigation as one of the things that's swirling, along with continued vote counting, along with a transition that is underway in some respects, as Kate has emphasized. We heard from the president yesterday, Mary, holding out litigation as sort of the ticket, the thing that will, in his view, correct certain things he alleges are mistakes in how this is all being run. Give us a lay of the land as to litigation, how likely it is you think that litigation will really determine the outcome here. What should folks who are interested be watching for in days and weeks to come in the courts?
Well, first of all, as you've written, Josh, it's not just that you can just go to the Supreme Court and have them decide the election, right? The Supreme Court decides cases or controversies that come up through the state courts or through the federal courts. And so most of the litigation that we see right now, and there's so much I can't even begin to keep up with it, is at the state court level. Separate challenges being made to a variety of things, including access by observers to the ballot counting process, including the ability to cure votes, although I understand that one maybe has been cure ballots. I think that one might have been withdrawn this morning or late yesterday, and other litigation over, the legality of certain ballots and whether they can be counted after certain timeframes, et cetera. Many of these have already been kicked out of court by the state courts because they're frankly quite frivolous and there's no evidence to support them. So as notwithstanding that the president said last night that there's a lot of evidence, Rudy Giuliani said the day before that there's all kinds of evidence, that just hasn't been produced. That is, for all that I can assess, misinformation. So I actually think it's pretty unlikely that this 4 or 5 multi-state press that the campaign is making right now to use litigation to prevent a stealing of the election is pretty unlikely to go anywhere, including to the US Supreme Court. Now, the Pennsylvania case that already has gone to the Supreme Court and that the court declined to accept certiorari or an expedited briefing schedule and let stand a Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision to allow for votes that are ballots that were cast before Election Day and arrive up to 3 days past Election Day, including through today, allow for those to be counted. The court let that stand. There were 3 members of the Supreme Court that suggested that they could still hear that case post-election. And in response to that, the Pennsylvania Attorney General determined that any ballots coming in during that 3-day period would be essentially quarantined, separated, so that if there was a resolution of that case at some point that said those ballots couldn't be counted and included in the tally, they would already have segregated them. All of that said, the Supreme Court still has not accepted that case for hearing on the merits. The Trump campaign, I think it was yesterday, moved to the days are just all blurring together. I really don't know anymore, but I think it was yesterday, moved to intervene in that litigation because that litigation had been brought by the Republican Party in Pennsylvania, not by Trump himself. That intervention motion is pending. So that's a case that, may or may not get resolved by the Supreme Court. But keep in mind, that's a case about a subset of ballots, those that are arriving within this 3-day period post-election that were, presumed to have been cast before Election Day. And the reason I say presumed is because of the postmark issue. Some will have postmarks before Election Day, but the US Post Office doesn't always postmark election ballot mail, amazingly. So some may not have postmarks, and the decision was to actually still count those even if they were coming in during this 3-day period. Anyway, not to get too far into the weeds, it's looking more, if it looks like that subset of ballots wouldn't be able to make a difference anyway, which we may know maybe even later today, as more of the Pennsylvania ballots are cast, then query what, I mean, then it's really not going to make any difference what the Supreme Court would say in that case. I would also say it's not at all clear, first of all, that they would take the case or how they would rule if they took the case, because again, the only statement we have is a statement of 3 justices, and there are 9. So I don't think this case, the bottom line, I don't think this case is going to be resolved through litigation at this point. Not through that type of litigation. Now, there are other possibilities that could have to do with whether any state legislatures try to pull some shenanigans and maybe send up a slate of electors that differs from the slate of electors that supports the winner of the popular vote in that state. That is something that is being passed around on ultra conservative media right now by some, suggesting that some of the Republican legislatures in places like Pennsylvania should just send up the slate that supports Donald Trump instead of the slate that would support Vice President Biden, should the results of the vote be that Biden took the majority of the votes. That would create a situation where you potentially have dueling slates of electors. There is a federal statute that applies to that should preference the legitimate state that was certified by the governor that represented the majority vote of the state. But it's another area where there could be litigation if a legislature seeks to change the law post-election or to sort of usurp the process and send up a dueling slate of electors.
And I would not be doing my duty as a member of Ryan's team at Just Security if I didn't take Mary's last remark and use it as an excuse to plug a great piece that went live on the Just Security site last night by Adav Noti of Campaign Legal Center, explaining why any attempt by a state legislature would be just what Mary called it, shenanigans, rather than something lawful or really fundamentally democratic. And so I would encourage folks to check that out on Just Security. And so I'm going to start feeding in the great questions that we're getting to this conversation as we continue, but I encourage folks to continue submitting questions. And I want to take something your way, Laura, that we have from Andrew Weissman, another top lawyer very much in the fray on all sorts of issues and a friend to all of us here. And Andrew asks about what can be done with what I'll call a disconnect, because we sit here listening to Mary. We understand that the legal cases as of now are not really keeping alive election hopes for Donald Trump, assuming the numbers of the vote tallies continue in the direction they seem to be in. But that's not what he says. That's not what some of his surrogates say. That's not what people say on Fox News about the role of state legislatures. They may not be calling it shenanigans at all. So what would you like to see private companies doing, government actors, to the extent there's space in the executive branch for others to say things, maybe congressional leaders? What would you like to see folks doing to try to correct some of those who aren't internalizing what we're hearing today about the state of play?
Yeah, I think I want to pick up on something you just said there, Josh, which is, these lawsuits aren't necessarily going to get anywhere, as Mary just kind of laid out, but that they're, certainly being picked up on by a lot of folks. And I actually think that that's really important to understand, because I think that, again, we're thinking about these lawsuits through as if they're a legal strategy, and I don't think they are. I think they are an information strategy. They are an information strategy aimed at convincing a large portion of the country that the election was illegitimate, that there was widespread fraud, that it lacked integrity, or frankly, that the election was stolen. And that has profound and long-term implications for our democracy, regardless of the ultimate outcome of this particular election. Also, by the way, I just wanted to note, and Mary kind of alluded to this, but the information ecosystem and the violent radicalization and the violent forces that she's talking about and concerned about, they are also connected. I mean, yesterday we saw a group pop up on Facebook that was initially couched in sort of First Amendment organizing terms. But many of us who've watched this ecosystem for quite some time saw the writing on the wall from the moment it popped up. And it took a matter of hours for incitement to violence to be rampant in that group. But by that time, the group had grown to hundreds of thousands of people and managed to set up an ecosystem of websites where they could drive people off platform to continue organizing even once the group got shut down. We are playing whack-a-mole still. And I think there's a couple of things we need to understand here, and I really appreciate the question on how we close this disconnect. The one is that we've got to stop talking about dealing with information operations and disinformation on social media through a content moderation lens. This is not what the problem is. The problem is the platform. Facebook has pulled the emergency brakes to essentially disable large parts of how the platform works in order to prevent incitement to violence from taking over the platform. When you have to do that, like Houston, there's a problem, right? And it's not necessarily just playing whack-a-mole. Now, that's not to say that like they're at fault for people who go on there and post these things, but the way that the architecture of the platform and of a number of these information platforms that are driven by virality, that are driven by emotion, that are driven by time on platform, these things promote this kind of content that takes people to the extremes, right? I mean, Mary talked about the hope being that some of this is just talk online. But the reality is that we've seen too many times over that the online and offline worlds are not distinct, right? And that we do have real world consequences of online content. And so I think that we need to have a real reckoning in this country with the role of social media. And I'm not necessarily saying this is for the government itself to take on, because I'm really cautious about government regulation of the platforms themselves. I do think there's a lot to be done, frankly, in rethinking how data can be collected, used, and retargeted at people. Because if we can rewire some of that architecture, it will change platform incentives. But beyond that, look at how local media is collapsing around the country. I mean, the story right now of the election and the counts is profoundly local. And yet in a lot of places, we have, fortunately, in places like Philadelphia, we still have the Philly Inquirer that's out there, right? But in places like where I grew up on the other side of the state, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette doesn't even run a daily paper anymore, right? And has been increasingly been taken over by partisan forces because of financial incentives that are driving out local media, that are driving out independent media. We really need to get a handle on reinvesting in the fourth estate in this country. It's always played a critical role. And until and unless we recognize that, we're not going to be able to bolster that. There was an incredible piece done by the New York Times last month about a network of supposedly local media outlets that had been set up. These are online websites, and they had been set up completely by essentially partisan political consultants who were just literally tasking the story they wanted to be written. It's not journalism. But until we get a real handle on that, we're not going to bridge that divide. The last thing is, I think that we need to recognize, I've seen a lot this week and I understand it, but I've seen a lot of commentary online from well-meaning people who've basically been making fun of and essentially being entirely dismissive of the large parts of the country that genuinely believe what they're being fed. We can't do that if we're actually going to heal the soul of the nation, as Joe Biden says, right? Like, we need to actually listen to people and be able to find and restore some sort of rational conversation, and at least meet people where they are, because ultimately in a democracy, if we can't do that, we've lost.
There is so much I could keep diving into in all of this, and I'm trying to be respectful of the questions coming in. Kate, I know we may lose you a couple minutes early. Let me come to you very quickly, if I may, with one of the questions that has come in for at least quick thoughts, which is, if it's a Biden administration, if it's any administration, what would you like to see from the federal government that would make our elections feel less chaotic, ideally be less chaotic? What would you like to see from the federal level in terms of the lessons learned from this cycle and what might make things a bit better in future cycles?
So a lot obviously will turn on what happens with these likely now, I think maybe definite now to Georgia Senate runoff. So I think that things look very different if you have, there is not a ton that the president can unilaterally do. You need legislation to address these election issues. But I think that, the Democrats have at the ready a big, multi-pronged kind of democracy and election overhaul legislative package that I think will continue to be tweaked. And if there is, even if the Senate is close, maybe there are ways to get some of it done. Certainly, if the Democrats are able to eke out a narrow majority in the Senate, then obviously the prospects look much better. But things like a revitalized Voting Rights Act, right? So it feels like a back burner story in some ways because there are so many election issues that have arisen, but a huge part of the reason or many of the challenges that have arisen with respect to this election are the kind of overlay of the pandemic challenges atop this already weakened election structure in which many, many states have shut down hundreds of polling places that they would not have been able to do under the Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court invalidated or the coverage formula, at least in the Shelby County decision. So I think there is an interest in doing a new kind of revitalized version of the Voting Rights Act, maybe call it the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, at least that piece of it. But there's also a lot of additional money that state election administrators need. There's the possibility of doing it at the federal level, creating an automatic, same day voter registration entitlement, maybe making Election Day a national holiday. That's long overdue. Maybe things have changed coming out of this cycle. And so, we're all going to be doing a lot more voting by mail. And so that imperative is less pressing, although, I'm a New Yorker and it just seems right to me that people don't go to work and school under normal circumstances on Election Day. So I think, those are a few of the things, but there are a lot of others. Increased campaign finance disclosure. That's, there's been a lot of whittling away at that, at that law by the Supreme Court as well, but disclosure is still, at least for now, constitutionally quite sound. And so that's something that I think we need to, increase, ramp up, fully staff and actually, create a real functioning federal election commission. The wish list is long, but I think many of the items on it are actually achievable. And I do think that I hope it doesn't get lost in the shuffle in terms of, dealing with both this pandemic and the economic crisis that a Biden administration will likely be inheriting. But all of these problems require a functioning democracy to address. And so I really do hope that those short-term, extremely pressing imperatives don't overtake the need to do democracy reform, really in the first few months of the administration.
It's astonishing, the list of priorities, when you don't know whether restoring the Voting Rights Act or have a fully functioning federal election commission, even how to rank those. That is a long list indeed. We're going to keep talking for a few minutes. I'm going to thank Kate in advance just in case we lose her before then.
I do have to hop off, actually. I'm so sorry, but thank you all so much. Okay.
Thank you for doing this, Kate. And quickly, I'll come back to Mary and Laura. Mary, let's just stay with lessons learned for a minute, because as you and I and our colleagues had the pleasure of working with the Lawyers Committee and others and seeing some of the issues that came in through this 866 Our Vote voter protection hotline, I thought one of your takeaways was just fascinating and something critical to improve going forward. Maybe you could talk about that for a moment, if you would.
Sure. I mean, there was much more heightened awareness, I think, by state and local officials, including election officials, about voter intimidation this year than in other prior years. They baked it into their training and they used products, including products that Josh and my organization, ICAP, provided, and others, Voter Protection Program, et cetera. But despite all of this good guidance, it was clear that there was a lot of confusion about what is the impact of this no electioneering zone. So every state has some zone around the actual polling place within which one cannot do what's called electioneering. And that means you can't campaign there. You can't hand out leaflets or buttons or wave flags. And it varies from state to state. It can be as small as 10 feet in Pennsylvania, which frankly is like no zone at all, or it can be up to, I've seen as much as 200 feet. I forget which state that was in, and everything in between. And I think despite best efforts to be informative about this, it was clear to us based on hearing the calls or reading the transcripts of the calls to the voter election protection helpline that a lot of officials felt like they only had authority to take action within that no electioneering zone. But the thing that is, but voter intimidation, the federal laws and state laws against voter intimidation, they apply everywhere. It's not a free-for-all outside that no electioneering zone. That's simply about where you can't campaign, but you still can't intimidate voters outside that line. You can't have an armed unlawful militia patrolling that line with AR-15s intimidating people. You can't have aggressively challenging directly people, you know, their qualifications to vote, or following them from their cars or taking down license plate number. That kind of thing you can't do even if it's outside the no electioneering zone. So I'm hopeful that the next election, we won't be even as worried about these kind of problems, but it's clear some of the things that need to be more informative. And I'll also say it was interesting seeing what was coming in terms of the calls. A lot of really ugly behavior, things like parking trucks in front of to block access to polling places, really aggressive shouting and yelling at people. Like I said, most of it not armed, so that's good. And some pretty bad police behavior too, including police, standing, flanking the doorways to polling places, in ways that can be very intimidating in many communities. Now, definitely the police have a role to play if they need to prevent voter intimidation, but they shouldn't be the ones engaging in voter intimidation. And we saw some bad behavior. So, again, I hope that at the next election, we really won't have, I'm hopeful we won't have the same state of affairs in the country that I think promoted this type of bad behavior, but I'm not confident, partly because of the reasons Laura's been talking about. Things are not going to, no matter who is declared the winner, this type of misinformation isn't going to end, January 21st. And so I'm wholeheartedly in agreement with Laura. Like, there is a big problem in this country that needs to be resolved, and it can't be resolved by just people on social media hating each other and the algorithms swirling into more and more of other people saying the same things about who they hate on the other ideological side. And that's got to be addressed if we're going to move forward in this democracy.
So let me give Laura the last word. I'm going to adapt a question from Danny Shulkin, a valued member of the Just Security community, and ask, what can we all do? We all are consumers of information. Sometimes we may find ourselves consumers of disinformation. We are people online. We are people talking with our friends and family right now. Give us something empowering. What can we do to do our part to make for a little bit of a healthier information environment in these coming days and weeks, to the extent we can? And we'll end with Laura's thoughts on that, but go for it, Laura.
Well, thanks. I'd say a couple things. I mean, one is, I found myself a lot this week having to just step away from the computer and chuck the phone across the room and go for a walk. I spent Wednesday raking leaves in my backyard, right? Not to give you my own personal coping strategies here, but I think that the platforms are designed to be addictive, and therefore we get addicted to them, and it's so hard. And especially in these emotional moments, it's very easy to get sort of sucked into that. And obviously most of the time it's not quite this intense. But I think that we really do need to find ways to spend more time offline. And frankly, to spend more time with people who we don't agree with. And look, I gotta tell you, I remember having a lot of these conversations in the wake of the 2016 election. I mean, Josh, you did not mention one of my prior roles, which is fine, but was Hillary Clinton's foreign policy advisor. So coming off that election was a particularly precipitous cliff for me. But I remember having a lot of conversations, in that moment of okay, we have to talk to other people. We have to do this, we have to do that. And then we all retreated to our bunkers. And I mean, some of that was the inevitable consequence of just the kind of president that the Trump was, right? But to Mary's point, this phenomena is not going away. And we need to do the really hard work ourselves of reaching out and engaging. So that's sort of point one. I think point two is like, we have got to hold our elected leaders accountable. And, you know, to Kate's point about, you know, what that might mean with a Senate in Republican hands, you know, I still do think that we've got to find some space for some of the smaller steps that we can take to rebuild our democratic institutions, to invest in them, to my earlier point, to invest in the media, you know, to one of my other passions about, you know, getting more money to election administrators. My God, we have seen the critical role they play on display on our televisions every day this week, but they've been doing so with massive, massive underfunding because Congress wouldn't pass it. We've got to hold our elected leaders accountable for some of these things. And I think that, you know, if we each kind of take these small steps, like remember this energy right now and keep challenging ourselves too, challenge our own assumptions. I mean, those are like very kind of touchy-feely sorts of recommendations, but I really do believe them. You know, I grew up, as I mentioned, outside of Pittsburgh, and it's a part of the country that I think a lot of people don't really get. Like, it's a great place. Please come spend some time in Western Pennsylvania, people. Like, talk to people who you don't normally talk to. Because I really think that this is the only way that we can actually, you know, heal some of these really damaging divisions.
Well, I can't think of a better note to end on than that. I also can't think of a better way to spend the last hour than with Kate Shaw, Laura Rosenberger, Mary McCord, digging into some of these fascinating and consequential issues regarding the 2020 election, national security, and really a whole lot more. So thanks to all of you for being part of this conversation. Again, a huge thanks to Ryan and to Rachel and other recenter and Just Security colleagues who pulled this all together. And thanks to all of you for spending an hour of your time with us. Hope you all have a great day.
Thanks so much.